So you go spend a few $100 on some fancy schmancy testing only to find out, oh wait, the test was incorrect and unreliable. And now what do you do? In today's episode, Amy and I are going to be talking about false positives with some of your more commonly loved functional medicine tests. Amy, what shall we start with? We already cooked up some ideas off camera. Where do you want to start? Where we were talking before, perhaps? Your theory?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about EPI,
which stands for
Exocrine Pancreatic Insufficiency. So it's basically when you have low pancreatic enzymes. There's a test called elastase that's used, or fecal elastase. You do it through a stool test. It's on a lot of the popular functional tests. It's on like the GI map. It's on the Genova GIFX. I know. It's on doctors' data too, right?
I think it might be. It's been a long time since I've ordered one of their tests, but I'm pretty sure it is.
It's on a lot of those tests. It's also on, you can do it through LabCorp or Quest. And Nikki and I were just talking because I've had a few patients with EPI who don't necessarily respond to enzymes. So like they get this test result back that they have low enzymes, and they don't get any responsiveness from taking enzymes, meaning like none of their symptoms are changing when they take them. So bowel movements aren't changing. They don't get any like relief bloating wise. Whereas I feel like a lot of people that have EPI, when they take Creon or enzymes, they feel a lot better. They're like, whoa, I notice a pretty big difference in my gut function. Which leads me to wonder, and again, I've done a little bit of digging, and some people that have diarrhea can naturally lower elastase. So it makes me wonder some of the cases that I've seen with EPI where there hasn't been tons of responsiveness to enzymes, if there could be a false positive with having, like with elastase levels being low. It could be falsely low due to having more diarrhea or looser stools. So again, it just leads you to wonder, like, ooh, if the interventions that typically solve the problem aren't working, is this a situation where maybe it was falsely flagged? And maybe this person's elastase isn't low or their enzymes aren't low. So again, it creates some questions for sure around what's going on with that test.
Yeah, well, and I think maybe I should have even started us with this. We have talked about this now a handful of times in recent episodes. So we did a stool test episode pretty recently. We did the truth about functional medicine. I think we did a lab testing episode about like what tests we might use with clients. And one of the major takeaways with any sort of testing, regardless if you get it through like LabCorp, Kaiser, Quest kind of a place, or, you know, a GI map or an OAT, I think you always want to take it with a little grain of salt and don't put 100% of your eggs in that one basket. But ideally, you want to have a clinical situation where you're not just blindly ordering a test and then blindly following that test. Like, I'm sorry, that's not rocket science. That doesn't take any real intelligence to do that. Instead, what you want to do is you want a situation where you're ordering tests that make sense for the individual. And then you're using that person's health history, prior diagnoses, other lab work, symptoms, and like whole clinical context to make sense out of that data, right? So that's one of the problems I see sometimes with functional medicine, for example, is that they will order the same gamut of tests on every single person. There's no rhyme or reason. There's no like real diagnostic workup. It's like, oh, every single person gets the same $3,000 worth of testing, no matter what their symptoms are. And again, that doesn't take a high degree of clinical intelligence to do that and do a protocol on every single person blindly. But then it's like we put too many eggs in the basket of the lab testing, and we're not willing to combine that with the clinical workup, the history, the symptoms, and really make the most sense out of it. So again, like you have somebody who looks like they might have epi. Okay, cool. Now you do a diagnostic trial with the enzymes. And if you try at least a couple of enzymes and you get no response from it, you've got to start wondering, maybe the test was wrong and you're chasing the wrong goose. I think that makes perfect sense. And I'll actually share this. I have not tried to research this or validate it at all. But when my daughter was about 2, she had a tummy bug and she was like vomiting and had diarrhea for just like a day or so. And then after that, she seemed like she couldn't tolerate milk anymore. Like at the time when she was that age, she was doing a sippy cup of milk every morning. And we started noticing that she wasn't tolerating that milk anymore. And I remember our pediatrician, who's not holistic at all, she's just chill for a conventional pediatrician. She brought up the idea that, she probably pooped out all of her lactase enzyme and induced a transient lactose intolerance. So just give her a break from dairy for a week or 2 and then reintroduce it and see how it goes. So I know that at least one conventional doctor is at least somewhat familiar with this idea of like, you might have just pooped out your enzymes and that's why you're not digesting the thing anymore. So if you correct the cause of the diarrhea, that might correct the laboratory testing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I like your overview concept too, because I think sometimes too, there can just be, if something looks super bizarre and doesn't make sense on a lab test, sometimes like rerunning the markers also interesting too. I've seen that a few times, even on just like conventional labs. It's like, this makes no sense why this would be this low when you've historically haven't had this level. 6 months ago, your level wasn't looking like this. Let's rerun it. And the labs seem to be better. So again, I think that one thing to never do when you get lab testing is to panic. Because I think sometimes it's easier said than done if you get like a lab marker that's off, or maybe it's not necessarily what you were hoping for. But yeah, I think that you have to sort of assess the case history and things like that in the current situation to really be able to interpret the labs properly. And again, sometimes labs are just off. None of these labs are perfect.
They're built by humans and therefore they are imperfect.
Yeah. And we were talking about before we came on too, with this EPI situation, there's different labs that do EPI too. So like we said, a lot of the functional labs have elastase, fecal elastase within the comprehensive stool test that they run. So GI map has that. Doctor's Data has that. Genova has that. I never really used Genova or Doctor's Data, so I can't really comment on their elastase levels, but I've historically seen when you look at GI map levels of elastase, it seems like they're more on the lower end compared to other testing. So if I had a patient and they were showing EPI on a GI map, or again, lower enzymes on a GI map, and then they went and reran it with LabCorp request, usually the LabCorp request levels would be higher and like consistently so. So again, that's something to think about too. Like some of these tests might be better tests for elastase. I wonder sometimes about like the comprehensive stool test if they're just trying to bite off too much.
Yes. Kind of jack of all trades, master of none.
Right. They're trying to bite off and they're trying to do a lot of testing within one stool sample. And it could just be maybe affecting the accuracy of that particular test. But yeah, I've historically seen that too. So like a lot of times I'd recommend if someone has had low levels on like a more functional style test to actually do a more like conventional test, so to speak. So like a LabCorp request fecal elastase and see how it compares. If it's consistent, like that's good that it's somewhat consistent, but that is something I haven't historically seen. I've usually historically seen it be lower on comprehensive stool tests that are more functional and higher on LabCorp and Quest tests.
Yeah, and this is a really excellent point. I'm glad you brought it up. So this was actually the first thing that really made me skeptical of the GI map. Before I did my split testing and posted that video to YouTube, I was becoming really skeptical because I saw the same thing over a number of years. Right. I would get somebody back with what looked like low elastase. I would immediately send them out for a LabCorp or a Quest follow-up test. And almost across the board, it almost always came back perfectly fine. And I had the same experience with Calprotectin. I had a handful of people where Calprotectin came back elevated on a GI map. And I thought, oh, gosh, golly gee, I might have to refer you to a GI doctor. You might need to get like a scope, a colonoscopy, a full workup for IBD. Like, this is actually concerning. And then I send them to LabCorp or Quest, and it's perfectly fine and normal. And I saw that happen numerous times over the years. And that was what really started the skepticism with the GI map for me, was just observing that trend. And then I think we had mentioned this in the stool testing episode. Also, the fact that nobody, literally 1% of people when I analyzed this, were flagged with low bifido, which made no goddamn sense to me.
False negative, maybe.
Yeah, that's a false negative right there. But yeah, I think you make a good point. The way that I saw it, if nothing else, even before I was skeptical of the functional testing, the way that I rationalized it was, if I send somebody to their GI doctor with a GI map test for elastase or calprotectin, the GI doctor is going to laugh at me. Or they're going to laugh at the patient. They're not going to use it, and they're just going to repeat the test on their own anyway. So I might as well go ahead and rerun the test through a lab that they see as more credible. And that way you can kind of like expedite the care a little bit, right? If you go in with a validated, reputable test that shows what looks like a concern, then maybe that GI doctor can get moving with treatment, maybe get them on Creon or start scheduling them for colonoscopy, versus if you make the GI doctor rerun the exam, well, now they need to book a second follow-up to talk about the test results. And it made sense for kind of like not getting laughed at sake, and also to, kind of expedite their treatment and expedite their care sort of sake. It made sense to rerun it and not trust the functional lab. Because I was just trying to get in the headspace of what the GI doctor would think when I sent it in anyhow. But you actually reminded me of a test that I wanted to bring up that we did not mention when we were off screen kind of planning this episode.
Oh, yeah.
And that is testing for short-chain fatty acids like butyrate.
Okay.
I don't remember who this was. I wish I remembered who I could credit with this. I want to say it was Lucy Mailing. It could be Ruschio, but I'm pretty sure it was Lucy Mailing. But I remember that somebody in this sphere brought up this idea that so first of all, short-chain fatty acids like butyrate are produced by your gut microbes when you eat complex carbs and fiber. And these short-chain fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. They help heal and fuel the colon cells and the epithelial cells. They're good for the nervous system. They're just tremendously wonderful and anti-inflammatory, and you want more of them. There are functional stool tests that either measure levels of short-chain fatty acids, like Genova does this, for example, or there are some of the kind of newer tests, like I'm picturing BioMFX, where they look at the genes that the microbes are carrying, and then they try to extrapolate from that what your capacity to make short-chain fatty acids might be.
Yeah.
But what's interesting with what I think was Lucy Mailing who brought this to my attention initially was what you are measuring in stool is simply that. It's just what is coming out in stool. That's not necessarily a measurement of what is being produced, because you also have to factor in that a lot of these short-chain fatty acids are getting absorbed and utilized. So she gave the example, I think it was ulcerative colitis, where those people are generally making enough short-chain fatty acids, but they're not absorbing them because the colonocytes are so inflamed and so just damaged that they can't take them in. So people with ulcerative colitis can actually have elevated short-chain fatty acids. And it's not from increased production, it's from a lack of absorption.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And then you could have the flip, right? You could have somebody with normal levels, but maybe they have a situation where their colonocytes are absorbing it really well, and now there's barely anything left over in the stool sample.
Yeah.
So, it kind of calls that into question. And then I think we might have talked about this in the stool testing episode, but I don't trust the whole genome sequencing tests that look at the genomics and try to infer what your production is going to be. I think that the technology is just way too new, way too young for me to put a lot of weight behind that. To be clear, I like BioMFX as a stool test. I just don't pay attention to the whole second half of the report.
Right.
I like the microbes, not necessarily
probably
the genetic.
What most people are paying attention to.
Yeah, that's the selling point. That's what makes it cool. But yeah, the genetic, functional part of the test, I don't use. But the microbe component of it, if you know what you're looking at with the microbes, I think it's a great test. But anyway, do you want to comment on that, the short chain fatty acids? And have you seen that to be really clinically useful? I know neither of us really order a lot of stool testing anymore.
Yeah, I feel like, again, I know that's on Genova testing. And again, I know I've seen it on the BioMFX, which they're kind of measuring different things. The BioMFX, again, is extrapolating from the microbiome of what they think the butyrate levels are. Whereas I think the Genova test is more actually trying to measure the butyrate, correct?
Yeah, they are. And so same thing with doctor's data. They're actually measuring the short chain fatty acids.
Right. So I have seen those. Again, I feel like historically, again, I ran more GI maps historically but I saw a lot of Genova tests just because you see them all.
Yeah.
You see them all when you work with people. Again, I think from my standpoint, if you're working on the microbiome and you're eating fermentable fibers and you're probably going to raise your butyrate levels. We know different ways to raise butyrate. And I think probably focusing on the intervention without getting super in the weeds on the actual levels might make the most sense.
Well, that's a good way to frame it, right? Because, okay, what would this test result tell you to do? If it came back negative, or if it came back abnormal and low, and you thought, oh my gosh, I need more short chain fatty acids in my life, don't we all? What would you do in response to that? I pray that you would eat more fiber and you would reintroduce FODMAPs and you would try to get more complex carbs and high FODMAP foods into your diet. But couldn't you do that anyway? Do you really need a $400 test to tell you to do that?
Well, and I think that's almost the crux with all the stool tests to a degree. It's they can be interesting and there can sometimes be some nuancy things you could potentially do with them. But most of the time it's oh no, you need to do everything, all the foundational pieces and eat the fiber and eat a diverse plate and, do all the things that we know helps diversify and strengthen the microbiome.
Well, maybe a good way to put it is do the right thing, even if you have no justification in doing so.
Right.
And to get a little bit more philosophical, it kind of reminds me of this. Some people have religion to teach them to not be an asshole. Right? Because you want to get into heaven and you don't want God to frown on you and stuff. But couldn't you just not be an asshole? And I'm not, for the record, I'm not trying to get into a religion conversation, and I didn't want to open that can of worms. But you know what I mean? It's couldn't you just eat adequate dietary fiber regardless of what the stool test tells you?
Right.
It's fine. Just do the right thing. And you could save yourself $400. Do you know how much green banana flour, a $400 GI map, that amount of money would buy you? Oh my God, you could buy out the store. You could clean shop at your local Whole Foods for that price.
Yeah, for sure. It's a bummer. And again, I think that's the problem with all these tests is that people get real lost in the weeds and lost in these individual markers and oh no, this is the thing. It instead of this being a fairly natural baby step, taking your time, but making changes over time and building from there, it becomes much more of I have this. It becomes much more of an urgent or I don't know, in the weeds type process instead of being pretty kind of natural, working on fundamentals that are going to take time and that's not going to shift within a day type mentality. Is just not usually the mentality that people go into and we even see this too, working with us, we generally promote a more long-term, patient, fundamental style of care. But still, sometimes, I know we talk about this amongst ourselves, it's like, we'll have someone that's just like not aligned. They may think that they're aligned, but it's like, oh no, they want the quick fix, but it doesn't exist. And so it's trying to kind of reel that in.
We're kind of trying to show you that the matrix doesn't exist, and we're trying to encourage you to like unplug from the matrix in a way.
Unplug from the matrix.
You know, if you had a good life in the matrix, or if you were comfortable enough in the matrix, that's going to be a pretty hard sell.
Right.
But, you know, we're over here knowing what the real world is like, and we're like, please get unplugged.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, you know, and I think this might be worth mentioning in this episode too, is this idea of biohacking has become really popular now. Stool testing, certainly, but also like genetic SNPs, like 23andMe, MTHFR kind of stuff.
Oura Ring, HRV.
Yeah. And like tracking all the stuff, like CGM, like continuous glucose monitors.
Yeah.
And it's neat, but that's sort of where I stop with it is, oh, it's neat and it's kind of fun. And if you're sort of a hobbyist, like I feel like I can be at times, it's fun to look at that sort of data. I'm waiting on a shipment. I just got a new, like, not an Oura Ring, but one of the newer competitors. It was on an Indiegogo, but it should be shipped to me kind of soon. And I'm excited to play with it. I'm not going to like get totally carried away with that data, but it's fun to just futz with it and see like, oh, I went on this trip and my HRV went up, or like, oh, I got COVID and my HRV tanked the day before I got COVID symptoms. And, you know, those sorts of observations are really neat. But, you know, I just had this conversation with a FODMAP Freedom student. So we're kind of between sessions right now. I'm enrolling the next group as we film this, and my most recent group has graduated, and now, you know, they're sort of entering the new phase of how I'm going to support them. And I was talking to one of the students, and she said, keep in mind, she feels pretty damn good now. Like she's pooping like a champion, really doing well. And she said, oh, do you think it would make sense in like 3 to 6 months for me to do a stool test, kind of for funsies? And I was like, well, it depends. If you can do it and kind of just have fun with it and see it as a neat thing and not get super freaked out by the results, you could. I wouldn't recommend it, but I had to tell her, I said, my stool testing does not look perfect on paper. And I feel fine. And I consider myself to be very healthy. So you just have to keep that in mind. Like if you go fishing, you have to be prepared for what you're about to catch. Yeah. And you have to know that you can handle whatever you're going to catch in this scenario. So she and I both concluded, yeah, maybe actually I won't do that. Like maybe I'm not just going to do testing for the sake of testing.
Yeah.
And it would be more anxiety producing than what it would be worth.
Yeah. And I do think we've alluded to this, but I just want to say it straight out and clearly. Like a lot of the biohacking stuff is like cool and newer, and a lot of the functional stool testing, oh, like this is cool and newer that we're like doing this and trying all this stuff out. But I generally think that it can lead to more inaccuracies and more like kinks that need to be worked out. And that doesn't mean the tool's totally useless in every situation, but it's like, oh, you have to take some of this with a grain of salt, and you probably want to do that more so with some of these functional biohacky type things that are newer on the scene than something like LabCorp or Quest that has a lot more like potential data and that kind of stuff behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and one way to sort of think about this too is that if your conventional doctor won't run a test for you, there's probably a good reason.
Yeah.
It's usually not that your doctor is just an idiot and they're ignorant. They almost always know that SIBO testing exists. They probably have seen a GI map test, actually. And they are choosing to not run that testing because they know damn well it's not validated and it's not worth the money you're paying for it.
Right.
And that, you know, that's a really tough pill to swallow, because I think I had shared at some point in these recent episodes before that one of the reasons why I fell in love with functional medicine was I was enchanted by the idea of test, don't guess. We can test for everything. We can have total certainty with every process in your body. I thought that was really cool and really appealing. And I thought, wow, I'm so on the cutting edge of science that not even the GI doctors are ordering this test.
Right.
And it was kind of like an ego trip, right? Like, how cool am I that I'm doing microbiome testing and I'm doing SIBO testing, and those silly goose GI doctors aren't even doing this yet. Ha ha ha, I'm so far ahead of them. And it's like, no, they know it exists. They just know that it's not a good test, and they're waiting for some sort of validation or proof of the concept before they jump on that bandwagon.
Right.
But again, this is kind of the whole selling point for the functional medicine profession, I find, is the idea of testing a bunch of shit that really we don't know that much about. Another classic example to segue us into our next one with false positives is the OAT test. So organic acids testing. Now, I had mentioned this to you off camera, but we cannot take credit for this, nor would we try. Lucy Mailing has a really great article that she co-authored with somebody else. I don't remember who it was now, but the title is The Uses and Limitations of Organic Acids Tests for Gut Health, a complete guide. And it's freaking great. They went through all of the research and really looked at each of these individual markers. So when you get an OAT test, in this case, we're talking about the one from Great Plains, but there are other variations of this test as well. I think maybe Diagnostic Solutions has their own version of it now, maybe. And then Genova, you kind of get some of these markers on like Nutrival from Genova. But the idea is that basically the top 3/4 of the first page of the OAT test is all of the fungal markers. And if any of those are elevated, then you've got yourself a fungus, my friend, and you'd better go nuke it and kill it and starve it. And again, similar to the GI map thing, I started becoming suspicious because I went through a little phase where I was ordering OAT tests on a lot of my patients, and I'll be damned, like every single person supposedly had some manner of fungal overgrowth. And, you know, it's like, anytime I get close to batting 100, I start getting really skeptical.
Right.
You know, like, oh, am I just seeing the yeastiest people on planet Earth? Is this a way more common problem than any of us realized? Or is the functional testing a bunch of bullshit? Which one is it? And so I had it on my research docket for several years that I wanted to do exactly this. And I wanted to do a video or an article really dissecting the OAT, and then Lucy Mailing thankfully beat me to the punch. And now I can just reference her work and I don't have to put in all those hours. But there was one marker out of the whole lot that seems like it has some validity. But the kicker, if I remember correctly, and I'm going to try to pull up the article really quickly here and see if I can find it. There was one marker that maybe has some validity to it as far as testing for fungal overgrowth. Hold on. Which one was it? Okay. So D-arabinitol was the one and only marker that might have some evidence behind it. But here's the kicker. Great Plains and Diagnostic Solutions, their version of the OAT test does not specify which arabinitol they are testing. So you don't even know if they're testing the correct one or not. The only test that really shows this specific marker, according to their notes, was Genova. And they specifically say D-arabinitol. But that's the one and only marker from a whole page of numbers that really has any scientific validity to it. And again, how many people have you seen who work with people like us, spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on follow-up testing and supplements and dietary restriction, all in the name of trying to kill candida that they may or may not have?
Yeah, it's wild. It's really wild. And again, I agree. It's a commonly I don't know if I've seen a test where it wasn't elevated, or at least I can't remember. The other one that's similar to that, and again, I haven't done like a major deep dive on it, but is it called mycotox? It's another Great Plains. Yeah, it's like their mold panel. Yeah, but like what's weird is they mention it sort of in the reports a lot of times. They're like, well, these foods all have this in it as well. So like sometimes with that, you wonder like, ooh, this is like a marker that's just commonly found in foods, it seems like. Is the person just detoxing this
or not
mold
even detoxing,
byproduct?
just naturally excreting.
Right, naturally excreting. Naturally able to excrete this this mold marker, or this kind of mold compound. And is it really a problem with the environment, or is it just like the transient amount of some marker that we get in our food each day?
Yeah.
I think that there's stuff like that too, which makes some of these tests so confusing. Because same thing with some of the candida markers. I know there's food stuff, again, that have fungal and yeast stuff as a part of that are going to grow and be a part of that.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I ordered an oat test, but I seem to remember like reishi, echinacea, cranberries,
right, blueberries. I think there's blueberries.
Yeah, there's
pear.
A handful of foods. Yeah, there's a handful of foods and a handful of herbs that they say not to take for like 3 days prior to an oat test. And, then you've got to wonder if people are being compliant with that or if they forgot and they had a whoopsie daisy. But
or again, if there's foods that just they don't know that have that compound.
True.
I feel like there's so many foods that probably they don't know that have mold or fungal aspects to them.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up a good one too that we weren't initially planning on including in this episode, but mold, mycotoxin, urine testing is another great example of something that, like you go to a mold doctor and, oh man, they're going to run this on you for sure.
Right.
And it's, again, really not validated. And I remember it was before the pandemic. So it was probably 2019. I got to hear a guy speak, Andrew Heyman. He's like number 2 only to Richie Shoemaker. And he works with Dr. Shoemaker. And they do like research and teaching together. So he's right up there with Shoemaker. He's the mold guy. And I remember he was saying that they had, he had his research team do a deep dive on urinary mycotoxin testing and looking at the scientific evidence for that. And they concluded pretty definitively that 100% of what you're seeing on that urine test is coming from your food.
Dang,
it is
crazy.
Not indicative of environmental mold exposure. He was very adamant. He said, if you want to test the human being for mold exposure, there's this whole big panel, like a SIRS kind of panel with like
how the immune system's functioning.
Yeah, it was like MSH and some, I forget the whole panel now, but there's a whole big expensive panel that you could run. Or he was a big advocate of just test the environment.
Right.
Like test the house, test the place, do an ERMI, get a mold inspector out there and just look in the environment for mold if you suspect mold. Right. Don't waste your time testing the human being if you don't have to.
Right. And again, I think sometimes it's like the mold stuff can be super obvious too, where you're like, oh yeah, I have mold. I've talked to patients like that where it's like, oh yeah, I have mold like in my bathroom. And you're like, oh, that's not good. And I think too, like some people are going to be more susceptible to mold, certain molds. Some people are going to be more allergic to certain molds. Some molds are going to be more problematic than others. So it's like, it is like kind of I think testing to understand what you're dealing with in the environment makes sense because again, you want to potentially know like the type of mold and how dangerous it potentially is or isn't.
Well, and you want to get rid of it.
Right.
You need to find it in the environment so you can get rid of it, hopefully.
Right.
Yeah. So that's another great example of something where I get it. It's like you go to the SIBO expert and everybody gets diagnosed with SIBO. Not us, obviously, but everybody else in this field. And then similarly, like you go to the mold doctor and everybody's diagnosed with mold. You go to the Lyme doctor and everybody's diagnosed with Lyme. Another one, I don't know if you remember her. Do you remember Grace? What was her last name? Was it Liu? There was a woman who kind of exploded on the internet I
know who you're talking about. She was
she was huge on the oat.
Right.
Like huge ride or die. Every human being on planet Earth needs the oat. This is the be all end all. Everybody has fungus. Everybody needs to obliterate the fungus. And I it's funny because I forgot about her until this moment, but She really made a big following for herself on Facebook at one point, maybe 2016, 2017, something like that.
Sounds about right.
And she held a conference. And I just remember some people coming back from that conference really pissed because it basically taught them very little. And it just ended up being a pitch for her coaching program.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like people flew from across the country for this thing. And it was like 2 little morsels of teaching. And then the rest of it was a sales pitch and people got mad. So I think she kind of dropped off after that point, maybe. But yeah, she was another one where here was this influencer who, I think she was a pharmacist by training, but here was this influencer who was credentialed and sounded very confident, like she absolutely knew what she was talking about.
Right.
And she did share some good research and some interesting research. Like that was where I first found out that H. pylori and Candida can kind of shack up together and team up together. Right. And that was new news to me at the time. But she was religiously hooked on the oat.
Right.
And yeah,
it's wild.
I don't see why.
Well, I was going to say too, there were a couple that just like came to mind listening to you talk. It's funny because some of the ones we were talking about before, there's more that are just coming out of my brain now.
This is such a big issue, right? Like we could do a 2-hour episode on the idea of false positives.
Right. So there's 2. So the first one being, you brought it up, which is like when you're biohacking and people are doing CGM. I see some weird CGM data that's not consistent to what like finger prick is saying. And I think, again, based on what I've heard from my friends that work in like diabetes education, they will say that Dexcom is by far the best CGM. And you want to be a little careful with some of these like new direct-to-consumer, but even like the direct-to-consumer stuff. Again, I don't know what methodology they're using.
They use Freestyle Libre though. That's the thing.
So they use Freestyle Libre.
If you can get it on the internet without a prescription from your doctor, it's Freestyle Libre.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if all of them were Freestyle Libre or what they were doing, but again, that can be very panic-inducing if like you're getting really distorted data from a CGM. And again, I think it could be a scenario where you could learn like the CGM's usually off by this much or something. Like you could kind of still potentially use it if there's a little bit of a discrepancy, because they aren't measuring exactly the same thing as a finger prick. So sometimes there can be some differences. So I don't want it to create this idea that the finger prick and the CGM always have to be 100% aligned. And that's how but they should be close. So if you're getting wildly off data with a CGM, and you're not realizing it or not kind of confirming with finger prick, at least at the beginning, that would be something I would do.
That's a huge one. And I'm really glad you brought that one up too. So I don't remember. I might have shared the story at some point, but I'll share it again here. So I had used a Freestyle Libre a handful of years ago. It was probably 2018, 2019, I experimented with it personally a bit, and I thought that it was fairly reliable for me at the time, and I was kind of validating it with fingerstick. And I found out, for example, like my blood sugar didn't go too crazy from carbs in general, and then amongst sugar, chocolate didn't have a tremendous impact, but dried fruit made my blood sugar go way up, for example. So I kind of learned that about myself, that dried fruit is kind of my big one that I need to be more cautious of. And it kind of gave me permission to enjoy my chocolate fix and not worry about my blood sugar as much. So that was good. I liked that. And then I took a break from it for a couple of years. And that it was maybe 2 years ago, I decided to
remember when you did it, because I remember
refill
you were
the prescription.
me.
I was telling you about
it. What the F?
Well, so I got the new prescription and my PCP was like, oh, by the way, they have a new sensor. It's like the version 2 or whatever sensor. And there's a new app. So you have to download the new app for your smartphone. I'm like, cool, that's fine, whatever. So I did. And that thing was a lunatic. And it was all over the place to a point where I had to buy a new fingerstick glucometer so that I could start tracking it. But I remember we ate dinner and we happened to not have any carb with dinner that night. It was just like meat and broccoli. It was a really plain Jane kind of a dinner for whatever reason for us. And I was getting ready for bed. I put Jess in bed And that was one night where she wanted me to snuggle in bed with her until she fell asleep. So I did. So we're having this like beautiful, tender moment, mother and child, but here's my, at the time, 6-year-old probably. And we're snuggling in bed. It's dark. She's just drifting off to sleep. I'm just thinking about making my escape and leaving the room. And then I'm going to step away from the microphone for this. No exaggeration. The CGM starts going berserk and is like, I'm like, oh my God. It could have woken the dead. Poor Jess freaked out. I freaked out. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go back. And I just like scrambled to turn off and I sprint out of the room. And my poor child is like, what the fuck just happened?
Right.
And I ran downstairs because it said my glucose was 50, 50. And that made no sense whatsoever. For me and the meal that I just ate, that made no sense. And I ran downstairs and I did a finger stick and I rescanned the CGM simultaneously. 2 minutes later, the CGM is now saying that my blood sugar is 100.
Right.
And the finger stick is saying 80. 80 made a lot of sense to me.
Right.
Going from 50 to 100 and that kind of swing. Well, I will say this. The alarm was truly alarming. And there was probably a lot of adrenaline pumping through my veins in that moment because it scared the bejesus out of me. So I believe that my blood sugar probably did go up because that alarm scared the willikers out of me.
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe that it could shoot me up 50 points in a matter of 2 minutes.
Right.
But the point still remains that neither of those numbers is anywhere near 80, which felt much more believable for knowing my body and knowing what I ate that night.
Right.
So it was after that point that, and there were a couple of other issues that I had with it at the time, but I ripped it out of my arm and threw it in the trash, and I vowed to not do it again until they get the version 3 chip ready. I think that for whatever reason, I think it was better initially, and now it's really gone down the tubes. I will put on my tinfoil hat briefly. I think it's because we have all of these direct-to-consumer products now. I feel like they've been mass-producing the Freestyle Libre to keep up with these companies where you can buy them online and everybody's being a freaking biohacker. And I feel like the quality has tanked because of that demand.
Yeah. I could totally see that. And again, I think too, like some of the advice from the direct to consumer sites are also like, they're like, your blood sugar should be stable all the time. Like they want the window of stability, I feel like a lot of times is really low. So like sometimes I'll talk to people that are doing like a CGM and they're like, well, my blood sugar went from 90 to 120. Can you believe that? And I'm like, yeah, that makes total sense based on the meal you ate. Like, so I think there's also a distortion of what should happen with blood sugar, and like people think it needs to be like within a 10-point window, which is absurd.
No.
So again, I think that there's also just a lot of weird advice with the CGM world, but I've had clients too where they've gone back to the pharmacy because they've had weird sensors, and then the pharmacy gives them another sensor and it's still weird. It's like still giving them bizarre data because I think it's either a bad batch, or again, maybe the sensors, like you said, are just mass produced and aren't consistent, reliable. I don't know what's going on, but it's a little bit crazy. So that was one I wanted to point out. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on the CGM, but I had one other one that came up.
No, just that I don't recommend them unless you're fully diabetic. And again, at that point, you would just get a Dexcom and be done with it.
Dexcom. It's going to be more expensive.
If you're not able to get one with a prescription from your healthcare provider, you probably don't need or want one.
Right. So yeah, I think the Dexcom makes a lot of sense if you actually need one. But yeah, the other one that kind of came up when we were talking is food sensitivity testing. That's probably the worst of the worst.
How did I forget this one?
Just don't order it. It's probably the end thing to take away here. But
can we also throw SIBO testing into this one? Like food sensitivity testing and SIBO testing, just don't.
Yeah, we've covered the breath test. I feel like, was that in the one where we were saying SIBO's overdiagnosed? I feel like maybe that was, if you want more breath testing.
Yeah, there was another one that we recorded a year or two ago that I think we titled Breaking Up with SIBO. And I think we covered it a bit there. But yeah, I think the most recent one where we discussed this was
I don't want to beat a dead horse, but you can go there if you're like, what? Breath testing is not accurate?
It's
or
terrible.
reliable.
No.
So you can go to some of those past episodes. But yeah, the food sensitivity tests, oh boy. There's really nowhere to begin or end. They're just bad all around.
Again, just don't.
Right.
And
I
feel like,
do you remember, I haven't seen them as much recently, but like the Everlywell, they were like cornering the market, and you would see like these commercials on mainstream channels where they're like, I had all these issues and it was an almond. Like, and again, what's so funny is I've never seen like one food come up on a food sensitivity panel. It's like a bunch of foods.
But that's how you sell the dream. Amy.
Right.
This is the thing. Everybody's hoping that there's just one magic bullet, one culprit, one bad guy, and then like, oh, I just need to avoid almonds. Well, that's pretty easy. And now I feel great. And they just run off into the rainbows. And it's like, no, what usually happens with these tests is that they turn up with every food that you have eaten in the last like 30 days. Right? And you're told, oh, you have to avoid all of these foods probably forever. And wow, you're so inflamed. And maybe you have leaky gut and you're host. And now you have the weirdest diet ever. Congrats.
Right. 100%.
I remember actually, I don't know if they still exist, but when I first moved to Phoenix, so this would have been like 2012, I started realizing it is really hard to make friends as an adult. I mean, like, I'm extroverted, I'm friendly, I can make friends just fine. But the thing is, when you no longer have school as the commonality that you share with your peers and people who are also generally a similar age to you, like you go from this incubator with similar interests, similar age, going through a journey together, so to speak, and then you go out into the real world and it's just like, yeah, good luck. So I moved states and I didn't have any friends. So I started going to meetup groups like meetup.com. And there was a paleo meetup group that I went to, which actually I did meet a friend there. But there was another one, they called themselves Freaks at the Table.
Oh, gosh.
And it was a whole group of people who had like 30 or 40 food sensitivities. Pretty much 100% of these people went to the naturopathic school in Tempe, Arizona, and they got the testing done at the naturopathic school clinic, as a side note. But, you know, these were the people who, they could only go to one restaurant because there was only one restaurant that would cater to these folks. And I went thinking, oh yeah, I belong with this group, because at the time I wasn't doing gluten, dairy, sesame, or potatoes. And I felt like that was a lot. And then I met these people and they had like a printout with 30 or 40 foods, and they would just send the printout back to the kitchen. Like, these are the things I can't eat. And I was like, whoa, this is intense. I actually don't think I belong as much as I thought I did. But now I look back at that group of people and I'm like, oh man, I wonder how many of them had stuff that we could help with, right? Like, maybe leaky gut or dysbiosis, or maybe their sleep sucked, or maybe they were super hella stressed and their vagus nerve was whizzled up into a prune. And like, maybe there were things that I could have helped them with, but yeah, it was wild.
That is.
And they were probably avoiding a lot of those foods unnecessarily, is the heartbreaking thing.
Yeah, that is really unfortunate, because I do think, you know, if you have a few foods that generally don't sit well with you, I think that could be reasonable. But if the list is like a printout 30 pages long, there's something underneath that. Whether, again, there's kind of potentially food fears from the test actually just planting the seed. You know, I think that's the problem with a lot of the low FODMAP diet too, is we don't really know the degree of which giving someone the low FODMAP diet then makes them nervous and scared to eat those foods. It's like the tests or the more recent research on like gluten. And if you give people who are non-celiac gluten sensitivity, if you give them gluten but tell them it's not gluten, or if you tell them that it is gluten even if it's not gluten, they have more GI symptoms to the non-gluten item that they were told was gluten, because their nervous system almost has fear of that gluten. It's like same thing with these food sensitivity tests and FODMAP diets, stuff like that. It's like we have no idea how much the expectation or the belief that these foods are harmful to me affects reactions.
Yeah.
We kind of do because we work with people, and
Yeah.
usually people can usually I see people being able to tolerate way more than they think they can once they sort of move through food fears. But yeah, it creates really weird issues too. Like it's a horrible invalid method. It's invalidated. It's just, again, like a real problem, food sensitivity testing, but then it also could lead to so many other things.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's been a while since we mentioned this, so this might be helpful too, is that when you have a situation where people are eliminating 20, 30, 40 foods, or heaven forbid, they're whittling their diet down to like 10 foods or fewer, that is not good for your microbiome. Well, first of all, hold on. Before we even give a rat's ass about the microbiome, it's not good for your body,
Right.
because you're going to be hard pressed to get all of your nutrients and all of your calories and all of your macros and your fiber from a group of 10 foods. I eat everything but gluten, and I still find it challenging to get all of my B vitamins, all of my protein, all of my whatever. And I need to be somewhat cognizant of that. So I can only imagine, if you're only eating a handful of foods, how challenging it would be to get vitamins, minerals, protein, fiber, carbs, fat, etc.
Right.
So you're almost guaranteed to be malnourished, and that's not going to do you any favors as far as healing and health goes. Then, secondary to that, it's also not going to be good for your gut microbiome, because we have some biggish studies now that are starting to demonstrate that you want a diverse microbiome. And the way to get a diverse microbiome generally is twofold. A, try to avoid antibiotics if at all humanly possible. And B, have a diverse diet, particularly one that is diverse in plant foods. So if you do a food sensitivity test and you erroneously eliminate, well, hell, even if you correctly eliminate some foods, let's give it the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that these tests can be useful and accurate for some people. Why not? You're still going to decimate your microbiome diversity. And that's going to decrease your short-chain fatty acid production, which is going to give you more inflammation and less immune tolerance. And now you have a vicious cycle where your immune system is less tolerant to the world around it. And now you're going to develop more food sensitivities, more food allergies, and more squirrely reactions like mast cell reactions as a consequence of the low diversity in your diet and the low diversity in your gut.
Right.
So like, even if we had somebody with a real bona fide food sensitivity or food allergy, you want that person to have as diverse and healthy of a diet as humanly possible so that the problem doesn't get worse and they don't create more food reactions.
Right. Right, my
bad
friend.
News bears.
I know we had some kind of more traditional labs too, like that we wanted to chat about as well, that can sometimes lead you astray.
Yeah,
so it's
do you
not
want to
just
start
functional.
us off with one?
Yeah, I know we were talking about like thyroid panels can be falsely distorted if you're on like a biotin supplement. It has something to do with the method of testing. Like I don't know all of the ins and outs, but I know like biotin disturbs however they test for that. So usually what happens then is that TSH becomes falsely lowered, and things like T3 and T4 can be falsely elevated. So it can give you sort of a skewed view of your thyroid. So basically the point being, if you were ever on like a B complex that had biotin in it, because it's a B vitamin, or again, if you were, I know Nikki and I were talking about like hair, skin, and nail supplements could potentially have biotin in them, or if you're taking biotin for any reason. Yeah, prenatal.
Multi-B
that's going to
complex.
potentially skew the results of your testing. And I would usually recommend stopping that before testing, but I don't think a lot of doctors suggest stopping multis or B complexes. It could be an easy one that can kind of fly under the radar.
Yeah.
And you might think, oh, my thyroid looks way better than it typically does. And it might not actually be better. It's just the test is kind of erroneous.
Yeah. And to be clear, just so people know, it's not that the biotin is treating the hypothyroidism or improving your thyroid function. The thing is that the test that they use to measure TSH in the laboratory is a biotin-based assay.
Right.
So it is genuinely a false result. It is erroneously flagged as low because it's like interfering with that assay somehow, versus, it might be tempting to be like, oh, but if biotin improves my thyroid markers, maybe I should continue taking biotin. It's not that. The biotin's not doing anything directly for your thyroid, to the best of my knowledge, beyond just, obviously, if you were overtly deficient in biotin and then you corrected a deficiency, then that could impact any number of tissues in the body. But yeah, it's easy enough to just cut that out for 2 or 3 days before you get your labs drawn. And even for things like testing for B12 or folate, I think it's prudent to discontinue your supplements and your vitamins for a couple of days before you do lab testing anyway.
Right. I totally agree.
Yep. One more, and to your point, so we're making the point here at the end of the episode that it's not just the functional testing that we're ragging on. And again, it goes back to the theme of the episode, which is just any and all testing or data collection, take it with a little grain of salt and really try to pair it with your clinical history, your symptom presentation, your clinical picture, and make the most sense out of it that way, versus just relying on the lab testing and being kind of blind to everything else. But, here's another example where a conventional test, LabCorp, Quest, Kaiser kind of stuff can lead you astray. And that is hemoglobin A1C. If you're using that marker by itself as the sole metric for your blood sugar regulation, that could potentially lead you astray and make you do things that are unnecessary. And so what I was sharing with you before we hit record was, I think it might have been an old Chris Kresser article, but I don't remember where I saw this the first time. I want to give credit to Chris Kresser.
I think it was Chris Kresser. I remember it.
Yeah.
When it came out.
And it was basically this idea that hemoglobin A1C is hemoglobin, like the oxygen carrying molecule that is carted around on your red blood cells. And as it goes around in your blood, it starts to pick up and attach to some glucose. And that's what we're measuring when we measure hemoglobin A1C. It's glycosylated hemoglobin. Mm-hmm. Well, the idea behind it is that the higher your blood sugar, the more sugar that's floating around in the bloodstream, the more likely your hemoglobin is to latch onto that and bind with that glucose. And that is true, but it's not the only variable that's going to influence this. Red blood cells on average live for about 3 months, but that's on average, right? Everything is a bell curve analysis. Mm-hmm. So most of us hang out in that 3-ish month time frame, but there are people walking around us right now who are perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, who live their life on either end of that bell curve. So there are people whose red blood cells live for about 4 months, and some people who recycle their blood cells after 2 months.
Those 2 month freaks.
Those freaks. But here's the thing. I don't think that's a bad thing or a good thing. Right. It's just, it's variability. But the number of trips that hemoglobin gets circulating around your bloodstream is going to dictate how much glucose it gets an opportunity to bind with, right? So you could have normal blood sugar, but if your hemoglobin gets a few extra rides around your body and it's exposed to blood sugar for that much longer, that can artificially elevate your A1C and make it look like you have prediabetes or diabetes when you actually might not. Mm-hmm. Similarly, you could theoretically have somebody with short-lived red blood cells and their hemoglobin only gets a handful of trips around the bloodstream, comparatively, that is, and that could artificially lower their hemoglobin A1C, even if they have elevated blood sugar on a day-to-day. So this is where you want to start pairing things. If you're really, really concerned about it, you could do things like a finger stick, like we mentioned. You could do that, like certainly fasting glucose is going to be super useful. You could even look at something like C-peptide or fasting insulin, or there's another marker. Not glycomark. Gosh darn it. I don't remember. I'll look it up real quick. Amy, entertain the masses while I look this up.
Oh man. Yeah, I think too, I've certainly seen people with normal A1C and still a lot of blood sugar swings. So like one thing too to think about, even if you had the 3-month A1C, if you had the typical average 3-month length of time and the A1C would be more accurate for you, you could still have sort of low lows and high highs, and maybe your average looks okay. So like maybe your blood sugar is actually swinging more and you might still have some work to do on blood sugar, but A1C still looks normal. So I've seen that a number of times where people still have some blood sugar swings that are like a little extreme, but their average is normal.
And that, you segued perfectly into what I was going to say anyway. So I found the name of the marker that was eluding me for whatever reason. It's called glycomark. Glycomark. And it actually would help you differentiate exactly what you're talking about right now.
Okay.
So you could look at average blood sugar. You could look at blood sugar in a moment in time. But you could have somebody who is swinging really drastically up and down, up and down. And that's what glycomark looks at. So the functional range that I was given at a seminar once upon a time is that glycomark should be somewhere between 15 and 30. I think that the reference range when you use it with LabCorp, I think it goes all the way down to 10. So 10 to 15 might be a little bit borderline. Ideally, it would be above 15. I don't remember exactly what the story was with it, but it was something to the effect that like glucose and this marker that they're testing for are both reabsorbed in the kidneys. And if your blood sugar is really high, this marker would be reabsorbed less effectively and it would go down. I think that's why higher is better with this particular marker. But again, I don't want to get too lost on the blood sugar thing. I guess the point is if you're using one piece of data to test something like blood sugar that's really complex, you might miss part of the story. So if the clinical picture and the history and the family history and the symptoms make sense and you want to work somebody up for diabetes or prediabetes, you might want to throw something in like this, and that way you could get a more complete picture. And again, like that's what I proposed in the beginning of the episode. We just want a complete clinical picture that takes into account history, symptoms, laboratory testing, diagnostic challenges. Like if you try to treat Candida 5 times and you don't feel any different, I've got news for you. You don't have Candida.
What?
Like, I know. It's madness, I tell you. It's madness.
6 times
you just haven't found the right antimicrobial. You need to keep at it indefinitely. But that is a type of data collection and it is valuable.
Right.
I just had this conversation with one of my FODMAP Freedom students. We were talking about how she did a 3-month stint of anti-Candida kind of supplements and she felt no different. And I suggested to her, I was like, all right, you have my blessing to try one more round. Like, instead of, I think it was monolaurin and undesalinic acid, like let's pivot and have you try caprylic acid and oregano, for example. Like, let's try a different combo, give it a month or so. And if you don't feel any different, I'm pretty well convinced that Candida is not the biggest thing for you. And you should probably pivot and work more aggressively on the vagus nerve kind of stuff that she had mentioned.
Right.
But yeah, that is a form of data collection.
Yeah, totally.
I think the key is being in tune with your body enough and being level-headed enough that you can listen to that data. Right? Again, if you are in a frantic, desperate, squirrely place, you're not going to make good sense out of that data collection, and you might make incorrect conclusions and incorrect judgments off of that. So deep breath, try to regulate your nervous system before you make any major decisions. And then, like we said in this episode, take all of that testing that you got done with a big grain of salt, and hopefully you're better off now having listened to this episode. What do you think, Amy? That's about a wrap?
That's a wrap for me. I got to go pee now.
Folks. Over and out.
Bye.